For the last few months, I've been running a train on my ear canals with 5 IEMs at 5 different price points ranging from $50 to $330, plus a bonus inclusion all the way up at the $1,000 mark so I could get a feel for what I consider to be the ceiling of this market. Sure, there are some IEMs over that price point, but come on. This video is not intended for audiophiles, so I'm going to skip a lot of the graphs and measurements, and you won't need a glossary to understand what I'm saying today. We're going to look at all these from both a music listening and gaming perspective, both casual and competitive standpoint, to see where I think you start to hit the point of diminishing returns. Got to give a big shout out to Critical. He helped me with some of the choices on this list and put me in touch with Shenzhen Audio and Linsol, who sent all these out, so big thanks to them as well. Full disclosure, a few of these on the list today are his collabs, but genuinely because I enjoy his tuning. I have to stress that no money changed hands. I don't have any kind of affiliate kickback with Critical or Shenzhen or Linsol. IEMs have some pros and cons versus headphones. One major thing is that IEMs are very easy to drive, so that conversation that occurs with headphones about whether or not an amp can handle a certain headphone, that's not existent here. Having a clean, high-quality source is as important as always, but power-wise, you can drive IEMs with practically anything. The sources I use today are the Apple dongle, the Audient Evo 4 priced at $130 as it has an XLR mic and it makes a great interface for streamers, and the iFi Zen DAC priced at $189, which is a stellar little single unit DAC amp that's generally my recommendation for anything but the most demanding headphones where you need to add their additional ZenCan amp. A great feature here is X-Bass, which you can activate with just the push of a button, and it sounds great for bass-heavy genres like rap or EDM. On genres or tracks where it's too much, you just push the button again. Easy. Comfort is kind of a push, because with headphones you have weight and clamping force to consider, and with IEMs you have something physically inside your ear canal, and that can be a make it or break it for some people. The beauty part of IEMs is that it doesn't matter how big or small your head is, and you don't have to worry about it messing up your hair if you're fortunate enough to have that. We're going to start with the Moondrop Aria first, because I've lost track of the amount of times I've seen these recommended to people who are new to the IEM space and want to keep it under $100. These are right at $80. This is a single dynamic driver. They have pretty solid detail and they're tuned to what I consider a consumer sound. So they're warm, fun, accessible. They've got an emphasis on the highs and the lows over the mids, or what you might hear people call a V-shape. You do get bass out of these. Some people say a lot of bass. I don't feel like it's a lot. It feels more like a light emphasis on the bass, or how I prefer my tuning. If you'd never heard an IEM that really put bass forward, I think this is what your brain would kind of expect bass-wise from an IEM. Highs are a little soft here for me. They're never shouty or stark sounding. Some stuff does get kind of lost in the mids. Layering, or the ability to hear multiple things happening in the same range of sounds, is pretty limited there. These are really versatile in terms of genre. They sound great with a lot of stuff and are also just generally pretty impressive for $80. They're pretty light, pretty small. The cable is a simple 2-wire braided paracord. These do include a carry case, and you get 3 sizes of silicone tips. The casing here is metal and the nozzle's pretty narrow, so I do find these to be very comfortable. If these were the first and only pair I'd picked up, I think the only thing that would leave me wondering what else was out there is chasing down a bit more bass for rap and EDM tracks, and maybe a little more detail in the highs, but overall, I think the Aria has earned its reputation for being a very safe recommend. I don't hear them doing anything that would be offensive to any listener. These sound pretty smooth all around. These are great for casual, more immersive gaming. They probably wouldn't be my choice for competitive. Competitive audio to me comes down to 4 main things. 1 is directional awareness. 2, it has to be clear when there's multiple chaotic things happening at once. Lesser audio products can get overloaded and mush sounds together. 3, I would like enough bass to where it feels fun, but not so much that it's overpowering details in the mids and the highs like footsteps, gunshots, reloads. And 4, to a lesser degree, soundstage or how big the world feels. For casual gaming, you should have some bass in there because it helps things feel more significant. Stuff like gunshots, explosions, engine sounds, etc. But for competitive gaming, there's kind of a fork in the road. I play mainly COD and mainly TDM, where audio is important, but it's not a make it or break it. I'm reacting to visual cues far more times than audio because of the low time to kill and the overall chaos of the pacing, but it does still feel nice to spin on somebody just because you heard them. Vanguard, in addition to being trash, is also really chaotic with kill streaks. Those can easily overwhelm lesser headphones, IEMs, and DACs. If I'm playing Warzone, audio is much more important. If you're purely a sweaty, ranked player, you'll probably want something with next to no bass and really clean definition and layering in the highs and mids. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Next, we're gonna go down to the $50 mark for the Truthier Critical Collab, the Zero. These are all plastic and they have a nice sparkly nebula thing going on. Comes with a little carry pouch versus a hard case. You get 2 sets of small, medium, and large tips with different bore sizes and a medium set of foam tips. Pretty generous at this price. Cable is all black, plastic, really flexible. These have dual dynamic drivers and a crossover that makes sure each driver has a dedicated range that it's outputting. That's unique at this price point. You have one driver focused on doing this. that's bass and sub-bass, and the other driver doing this, that's mids and highs. This is tuned to the Harman curve. If you don't know what that means, don't be afraid. It just means that something is tuned, bass, mids, and highs, to a presentation that would be pleasing to the largest majority of consumers, not audiophiles, regular people. To me, these have a tuning that's pretty similar to the Aria, but with more detailed highs, warmer lows, and sub-bass. And due to the way it's designed with the crossover, the bass doesn't interfere with the highs here. And I mean, these can get stupid low. With the X-Bass on the iFi or any software EQing, these will easily vibrate your ear canals and the sides of your face. The other difference is that the highs are just a touch more forceful here. The very top edge of female vocals can get a little sharp for me on certain tracks. I'm not super big on the pervy waifu shit on the front of the box. That's probably one of my least favorite parts about IEMs, if I'm being honest. I really like these for gaming as well. Imaging and directional stuff was great. You might find that bass to be a bit too much, even with that crossover in there, but again, we'll talk more about that in a sec. Overall, these at $50 or the Arias at $80, I would go these. Next up is the Fio FE Eclipse at $149.99. We're going up almost double from the Arias or 3 times the Zeros. These come with a nice hard shell case and a soft pouch as well. The cable's really good here, flattens out easy, and you get a wealth of tip options, both silicone and foam. Based on what I'd heard, I expected these to be a higher end version of the tuning on the Truthiers, and that's true to some extent, just with a lot more bloat, and these are 3 times as expensive. The big difference in regular terms is that there's just more bass here, more mid bass too, so it makes a lot of tracks already sound thicker and more substantial, and then it gets really low. Actually, more so than I would want for a lot of genres. They're really detailed. Just this tuning isn't my particular cup of tea, which is surprising because I generally like a bassier presentation. There's virtually no upper mids here for me, and the highs come across as shouty or stark on a lot of tracks. These are a little too fatiguing for gaming for me as well for those same reasons. It's just too intense. These are also the least comfortable of the mix for me so far. Now, that's not to say these are bad, they're just not for me. These seem ideally suited to specific bass-heavy genres, and they're not my favorite for gaming. Due to the lack of versatility for my use case and the comfort, these are a miss for me. This brings up an interesting point that you're going to run into a lot if you're watching videos about headphones and IEMs, and that's what makes one better than another if they share the same tuning. You can EQ almost anything to accentuate the same frequencies, but what sets one apart from the other is the detail and the tonality that they can execute that with. So just because 2 products share a similar tuning doesn't mean they're going to be able to execute that with the same level of detail. Next up is the widely hyped 7 Hertz from Timeless. These are planar drivers. They're round, which is weird, and they come in this milled aluminum box, which is awesome, and they cost $220. It wouldn't be a big surprise if you've never heard of planar magnetic headphones. This is something people generally stumble onto when they start to get into audio as a hobby, but they do come with some fairly standard characteristics. They generally have some decent bass, they can reproduce that bass very fast, think like double kick drums, and they sometimes have a slightly metallic timbre or tonality. And that's a pretty good descriptor for these as well. If you watch reviews on these, you'll hear people talk about the large amounts of bass, but in comparison to the stuff we're looking at today, they have notably less bass than the FE and maybe on par with the Zeros. The treble is interesting here. Cymbals particularly have the ability to cut through the mix. It sounds great on most tracks and odd and splashy on others. The highs are never harsh to me. This is a smooth, soft, spacey presentation where the vocals feel pushed out a little bit in the distance. It's also the first one that wasn't just adequate, but was interesting enough for me that I wanted to go back and listen to a large portion of my catalog. But these are weird for me for a couple reasons. One, there's some specifics on the tuning here where they don't sound great on every track, but when they do, they sound really great. And 2, despite what I've heard people say, these sound really wide to me in terms of soundstage or how big the audio world feels. Oddly, it's that soundstage that makes me not a huge fan of these for gaming because they sound wide and soft, and sometimes it adds artificial distance, and it's tough for me to tell exactly where things are coming from. It's a shame because I really like that for music, but it just doesn't translate well here for gaming. Based solely on music listening, these are definitely worth the hype, but they're just not something that's going to be able to pull double duty for me. Next up is the Blessing To Dusk, not to be confused with the Blessing 2. This is Critical's collab tuning, and you guessed it, heavier on the bass versus the standard Blessing 2. These have 1 dynamic driver and 4 balanced armature drivers. At $330, these do a lot of things really, really well, and one thing that I absolutely hate. These are unsurprisingly the best of the lineup today in terms of music listening. It's as if these were tuned specifically for my tastes and the ones that really made me feel like I could trust Critical's tuning. Like we talked about earlier, the tuning here is very similar to the Aria, but the execution, the detail, the layering, etc., really just on another level. Again, Again, not surprising for nearly 4 times the price of the Aria. The big thing that sets these apart is that there's no genre where these don't absolutely perform. They're just never too anything. They're never too harsh, too shouty, they never sound too hollow. The tone is really natural for acoustic instruments. There's never too much bass, and they never leave me wanting more bass. The cable is fine, nothing fancy. They come with a decent carry case. Here's the part I don't like. The nozzle is smooth plastic and it doesn't have any kind of lip on it. So every time I take these out of my ears, there's about a 50-50 chance that the ear tip stays inside my ear. Worse still is to make the most of these, you really have to have them pretty far deep in that ear canal. And yes, I have absolutely had to use tweezers to get one of these out of my ear. These can get a little cluttered in TDM, but they're very solid in Warzone, even with a lot going on. Again, if you're going strictly sweat, maybe look at the standard Blessing 2 that's going to be lighter on bass, but as an all-rounder, you'd be really hard-pressed to do better than the Blessing 2 Dusk without spending substantially more money. So if you've picked up on it, there's a recurring thing here about too much bass being a bad thing for competitive gaming because it can make things sound muddy when there's a lot going on, and that's arguably when it's very important that you're able to hear all the details and cues. But I don't necessarily want an audio product that only sounds stark or clear or clinical and lacks that low-end energy. Personally, I wouldn't buy something that costs several $100s if it wasn't also going to make my music sound great or give me an immersive experience for casual gaming or movie watching. I don't get too into software EQing my audio gear, but there's a free app from SteelSeries called Sonar that makes this dead easy. Like, here is a flat EQ and here is the EQ for Warzone. It legit just deletes the bass, it boosts some frequencies in the highs, and it doesn't compromise any other aspect of the sound. So you can remove the bass for competitive sessions and still have something that sounds great in every other situation without having to buy multiple IEMs. This doesn't work 100% for every headphone or IEM, but it gets you pretty close. Of the list today, the only one that this didn't really work on was the Timeless, because with that soundstage, it just kind of sounds spacey and hollow, and the directional cues aren't really direct enough. Now, this is all the way up to the $1,000 mark for the Monarch Mark II from The Audio. It is a very complex beast. It has a single dynamic driver, 6 balanced armature drivers, and 2 electrostatic drivers in each side. It's honestly tough to describe how good the sound is here. This is another fun tuning, but it's probably the most balanced of the entire lineup today. There's an obvious push to the bass and the highs, but it doesn't stop the mids from being very detailed here. This is one where you can focus on any sound and pick it out from the mix with serious detail, but the mix as a whole never has too much of any one thing to me. It's honestly an experience. I'm sure there are some technical aspects that serious audiophiles would pick apart here, and at $1,000, you definitely should be critical. This is the only IEM I've ever heard at this price point, so I don't have a lot of context here. Sadly, this is not a very comfortable one for me. If you've seen the memes of fitting 4090 GPUs in various cases, that's basically how my ear canals feel. Even with a spread of sizes of both silicone and foam tips, I either don't get a proper seal or my poor ear holes get filled out like an application. The cable here seems to be very high quality, being paracord, but I'm not really a fan of it as it doesn't really behave on the desk. This is also the only one of the lineup that can take advantage of the balanced Pinacon output on the Zindac. It makes really good use of the power output there, and it gets plenty low to the point that the X-Bass is overkill, and it does that without muddying the highs of the mids. It sounds good on the Evo 4, but the low end is noticeably less controlled, and there's really a small volume window between like 55 and 65 where it's loud enough, but it's not distorting. This one for me really begs for a proper DAC amp. The detail is crazy, and it creates like a full 360-degree soundstage. It really can be the audio experience you would expect at this price point, but these are 3 times the price of the Blessing To Dusk, and if it were my money, I'd be much happier spending $330 on the Blessings than I would spending $1,000 on these. Gaming on these can be a little chaotic because I feel like I'm hearing everything all at once all the time, and it makes it pretty tough to hone in on certain important stuff. This is helped by cutting that bass out, but for competitive gaming, I just think there's better ways to spend $1,000. Obviously, this lineup here today isn't the end-all be-all for these various price points. There's a ton of different IEMs out there, but it did feel like a good place to start. I wish, for video's sake, that there was some big moment here today where a sub-$100 IEM absolutely mopped the floor with a $300 IEM, but that's just not really realistic. The Blessing To Dusk is the personal winner for me here today if that's a price point you're comfortable with. I go back to these over and over. They have far more time on them than anything else in this lineup. If you are more budget limited, I would recommend the Zero over the Aria. They're really stupid good for $50. It would be interesting to see if there was anything under $100 that outright beat them, but there's damn sure not at 50. IEMs aren't gonna replace headphones for me. I don't think I game better with either or, and I do get pretty tired of having stuff in my ear canals pretty fast. I also just like using an open back headphone because of the staging, but I don't think it offers any distinct performance advantage. The sealed, closed off nature of an IEM can be a little claustrophobic for me, as I do like to hear my mic in my headphones. That's one reason why I would reach for an interface versus a DAC amp for these when gaming specifically. For competitive, I honestly find myself using a wireless gaming headset more than a high-end audio setup most of the time for the ease of the mic, the chat mix, and the side tone. I would definitely be interested in hearing any sub $100 recommendations you have down in the comments, stuff you've personally used that perform well in any specific category, particularly competitive gaming. I do think there's going to be a lot of conversation to have between that $300 and that $1,000 mark, so I do have the IE300 and 600 coming from Sennheiser to check out pretty soon. That's it for today. I will catch you all in the next one. Stay up.